So tonight's talk is entitled Here and Now, Keep Calmly Knowing Change. And you may be familiar with this phrase as a kind of shorthand for the Buddha's teaching of the Satipatthana Sutta. That's a teaching that is the discourse on the practice of mindfulness. As the Buddha said, for overcoming sorrow, for walking the path of truth, for seeing things as they really are. And for me, one of the things this phrase does, the keep calmly knowing change, is that there's a kind of a quality to this aspiration, and each of those words serves as a sort of guidepost, if you will, for this practice. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about each of those guidepost words and their traditional meaning, but also about the possibility of what they might mean in our living now, here in the summer of 2020. Following these guideposts, keep calmly knowing change, doesn't mean that things are going to work out like we want them to or might expect them to. Really, what it means is that we can be in a relationship with what is, whether it's despair or enthusiasm, and be in that relationship with a growing resiliency and even at times a joy. Sometimes when we hear these words, keep calmly knowing change, we consider that, well, at least sometimes we're doing okay with this. We're practicing well individually. We're coping with change. We're establishing some equanimity at times. But sometimes we also can drift into a kind of numb placidity. And Jeff spoke a couple of weeks ago about how easy it is to turn away from anything that's unpleasant or repulsive or distressing or vicious. And also about how important it is to recognize that human response. That turning away is just the organism trying to protect itself, to take care of itself. So one of the things that is required of us is to see that human response with some compassion and also with some strength. Thich Nhat Hanh has said, we don't meditate to become good meditators. We meditate to be more awake in our lives. So, how is it? What is this being more awake? How do we stay alive to the roots of this deep wisdom? Keep calmly knowing change. Part of it is an issue to maintain an awareness of things in relationship to other things. So what's happening? What's my response to it? What else is known? Sometimes when paradigms begin to shift, or when we wake up to systemic racism, for example, or when loss rips off the door to our hearts, we can look to these guideposts, keep calmly knowing change, to allow us to have a greater capacity to stay, to strengthen our awareness. Do you remember that song by Bob Dylan? Or maybe you don't if you're a little younger. It was more than a half a century ago when he sang, "The times they are a-changin'." And I listened to the lyrics today, listened to Bob Dylan sing that again today, and just how remarkable those words are applicable to today, to this life right here in 2020. I think I was about 15 the first time I heard him sing that more than 50 years ago. And then, like a lot of people of that era, I was caught up in the 60s, the movements of civil rights, the voting rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, the concerns with women's liberation. Coincidentally, if you don't know it or haven't read about it, today's the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave voting rights to some American women, but not all. The times they are a-changin'. There's no time in history, in geology, in biology, that's without change. It's what we can count on is kind of a truth, the impermanence. So harking back to an earlier comment, the question then really becomes, how do we do this? How do we keep calmly knowing change? To aspire to what's kind, cope with the unexpected, respond with some skill to what's here now. We can become more aware of change just by tuning into the natural world, thinking about the course of the pandemic that began in late winter in March, feeling the chill of that inside, outside. Then through spring with a kind of sprouting of some hope, as well as the greening earth, the ripening of summer with July heat waves and the copious rains of August. A few of the things I noticed was that there was a long, long firefly season this summer, which was pleasant. There was a reduction in butterfly numbers, unpleasant. And there's a proliferation of mushrooms everywhere. A kind of neutral response there. So we know change in thoughts, in our states of mind. You might consider also the reshaping, the reshuffling, the adapting of these past months, whatever's transpired in your thinking, in our hearts with the pandemic, and all of those ensuing changes. The basic premise of this instruction to keep calmly knowing change is that limitations of human sensory experience will mean a certain level of stress and anxiety. What's unknown, what's unresolved, what's unclear, sickness, existential anguish, even subtle sense of dissatisfaction. They're all part of our daily experience. So to keep calmly knowing change is really a kind of investigation. It's a discernment to remember that which we have forgotten or that which is split apart. If we take a look at this teaching, at each element of it, here are some notes that have to do with each of these pieces. The word keep means to bring a diligence, a steadiness, a curiosity. What's this? It's both an inquisitive attention and a willingness to sit with discomfort. be it a defensiveness, a shutting down, or a dismissiveness. What's here now? Last month, Lama Rod Owens, who was a Black Buddhist teacher, was asked in an interview about being an ally. And this is what he had to say. And he's, of course, responding to this question of racism, which has risen to the fore in our nation and elsewhere. And what he said was this: allyship isn't the only work that's required to undo whiteness. The work that's required to undo white supremacy is actually coming into a relationship with brokenheartedness and the trauma from whiteness, and learning how to sit with that and experiencing that. To sit with all the manifestations of white supremacy from our ancestors, the disappointment of being born into a system that disproportionately disadvantages brown and Black people, to sit with the totality of everything. And you can sit with it, you can do it. But without sitting with it, without getting close, it won't be changed. So one way to look at this word to keep is to recall your own capacity for diligence, to intentionally create a little space to meet whatever feelings come up: heartache, anger, grief, confusion, whatever is arising, to give that some space, some allowing. It's only from this grounded space within that we can be open to the perspective of another viewpoint that we initially perhaps totally disagree with. But it is this place of keeping open, of staying, of not leaving, that both learning and unlearning can begin. So speaking of allyship, there is such a word. What if we had an allyship card that expired every day? How is it that we can get up and keep practicing diligently, renewing our commitment in whatever shape or form we deem useful, skillful? So maybe watching that piece from the Clergy Collective could be one of your commitments in the next week or so. Because being an ally isn't a destination, it is a practice that requires keeping on. The second word in this phrase, calmly, keep calmly knowing change. Calmly, of course, can mean a variety of things, but one of the things it references is that this noticing is balanced, like the proverbial tuning of the lute or guitar string. It's not too tight and it's not too loose. There's a balance here. So calm can be clarity, sort of the ability to experience something just as it is. And calm could also be considered a kind of equanimity, which has perhaps more to do with the willingness to experience something just as it is. So both the ability and the willingness to experience things as they are. An example of this might be when you hear the word or read the word racist, it can be loaded with very strong feeling. This instruction for calmly asks if you can just breathe with that feeling, with whatever arises with any strong reactivity. And don't forget that you're human, because sometimes we're hard on ourselves, we're hard on others. So if you say or do something that you assess as having caused a harm, take a minute to remember you are human. We make mistakes. Shine the light of compassion on yourself, just as you would for anyone on this call tonight, your best friend, your pet, your beloved. And then discern if you'll take action of any kind, whether it's an apology or whether it's simply learning more about why your words or your action was hurtful. Philip Moffat, who's a teacher on the West Coast, once said that we all need to get the concept first. We've got to have the idea planted first so that we can then reflect upon it and begin to integrate it with our being. So this calmly piece, keep calmly knowing change, it's asking us, be curious, be willing to broaden your understanding, and do it so from a place with some balance, some steadiness. Keep calmly knowing change. Knowing is something that can be done internally and externally. That's the teaching. So noticing what's arising, what's passing away, and seeing clearly the impermanence of it all. So another example, while there's no denying impermanence or the truth of our interconnectedness, so at some level we say there's no separation, but it's important to remember that the lived experiences, for example, of whites and of people of color are very different. Each one of those experiences is informed and influenced by intersecting privileges and oppressions. So part of this practice is honoring similarities, the interconnectedness, but also honoring lived differences. One way to imagine mindfulness of this might be to imagine mindfulness like the neck of an elephant. You know, when an elephant looks, it doesn't just turn its head and look, it actually turns its whole body and looks. I can attest to this, having been in a Jeep with an elephant who was perturbed at how close the Jeep was to him. And he didn't just turn his head and look at us in the Jeep, he turned his whole body and gave us his full attention. So we can do the same. We can turn our whole body to give full attention to the matter at hand. And the last word in this phrase, keep calmly knowing change. Change as complexity. not the numbing out of things will never change, which is easy to fall into sometimes, but just noticing how the mind works, how it wants to categorize things, how it wants some simplicity, some answers, some yes, some no, some it's like this now. So one way that we might work with this is just to slow down, to notice the mind wanting a concise, simple answer now, to notice that and breathe with the messiness of it all. See if it's possible to notice without getting tangled up in the grasping for certainty or the aversion of anger or the numbness of confusion. And what happens with that practice is there's a slight decentering of the self. The self doesn't reside at the center. A way to apply this to what's current here and now for many of us is, if you want to support a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, then see how it is to take yourself from the center. And wherever you can, to see what it would be like to center, promote, and support marginalized voices who have experienced racism, bolster and endorse their good leadership. There's an African American Buddhist teacher who was in the CDL with me at Spirit Rock 10 years ago. She goes by the name of Ayo, but her full name is Pamela Ayo Itende. She says, for our survival, we need inspiration that reminds us we can only survive together, not through individual awakenings alone. We remember that the transformation of suffering is a communal and a collective endeavor. The pain that we feel for ourselves, for our world, it's a living testimony really to the interconnectedness we have with this world. Joanna Macy says, if we deny this pain, we become like blocked, atrophied neurons, deprived of life's flow and weakening the larger body in which we take being. So she suggests that, what if we just let it move through us? If we affirm our belonging to this big web of interconnectedness, is it possible to open to the pain of the world, seeing it that it can neither shatter nor isolate us? Keep calmly knowing change. Because we've been conditioned to view ourselves as separate, as competitive, as fragile entities. So it takes some practice to relearn this kind of resilience. Instead of bracing against that which we don't want, we could breathe through the feelings, the thoughts, the news, the mind states that we don't want. And allowing this flow to strengthen our sense of belonging in the larger web of being. So in summary, keep calmly knowing change might include these practices. Just see how you respond to these possibilities. The first one being sit with discomfort. Meet mistakes with equanimity, recognizing your humanness. Honor both similarity and difference. Expand your awareness. Our own website has a wonderful way to do that in this realm of learning more about racism. Hold space for anger. Let things be complex. Summon courage. Decenter yourself. Keep showing up. Practice self-care. Because life is a marathon, not a sprint. Thank you for listening tonight, for your practice in the spaces where you live, work, play.